Recently I published a video with a refutation of the Falkbeer Gambit, and after that somebody posted a comment saying, "Before this even starts, I know I love this video and have my heart broken," just like when a video comes out about how to crush the King's Gambit. So guys, I'm really sorry for refuting some of your favorite opening lines, but just like you asked, there we go with a refutation of the King's Gambit. Well, in this case it's not literally a refutation, but just a really good and powerful line against it. King's Gambit happens after the King's pawn move, and here if you play pawn to e5, you gotta be ready to face the move pawn to f4, which is a very dangerous opening line if you are not prepared, but this video will get you covered. So first of all, before we get into the proper line for black, let's just understand the white's idea behind the King's Gambit. What is it that white is trying to achieve? In case you make the most natural move and accept the gambit by taking this pawn, white is likely to respond with knight to f3. Now let's just understand what is white trying to achieve by sacrificing the pawn. Let's say you're playing something like pawn to d6 or any other move and white goes pawn to d4. By doing so, they're trying to get the pawn back, so if you want to keep it, you'll need to play something like pawn to g5. Now we can evaluate the outcome of the white's gambit. Yes, indeed, black won this pawn at f4. But in order to keep the pawn there, black had to also weaken their position by placing another pawn on g5. Therefore, the black's king will be a long-term target for white. That is the one factor in favor of white. Secondly, white is ahead in development. He's already brought the knight out. He's ready to, let's say, bring the bishop out to c4. After white castles, let me just play a couple more moves. After white castles, this rook also comes into a potentially dangerous position, because even though the line is closed right now, white can try to force opening up the f-file, and then together with the bishop, the rook will start hitting the black's king. And the final note about this King's Gambit is that it allows white to deflect the black's pawn from e5 to f4, and because of that, white can build up these strong pawns in the center, which is another positional achievement of white. So these are all the factors that made the King's Gambit such a powerful attacking opening. Knowing that, we can now understand how are we gonna counter it. Here's what I recommend you to do here. First of all, you can play the move pawn to d5, known as Falkbeer Countergambit. And the nature, even the title, the Counter Gambit, suggests that you do not want to defend, you want to counterattack. Therefore, you're allowing white to capture one of your pawns here so that you get actually a more active position. You don't want to play the second-hand player, you want to be an attacker in this game. Now, white has the choice between capturing one of your pawns here, either pawn on e5 or pawn d5. And the choice is really simple, as one of these moves is just a beginner level mistake, which is the move pawn takes e5. That said, let me show you one thing real quick. I just reached out the database of games after white played this wrong move pawn takes e5, and if we scroll to the players played it, just look at this. Dr. Nichterstein, who is none other than Magnus Carlsen, played this beginner level mistake. So I'm not really sure whether it's a beginner level mistake or not, but either way, here if you play the correct move queen to h4, you're winning the game basically immediately because it attacks the king, and if white covers it, you're taking this pawn with a queen with a double attack to the white's king as well as the rook. Thus, in this line, you're simply winning the rook for nothing. Alright. Of course, if you're playing against Magnus Carlsen, things are really simple, but what if you're facing anyone else? In this case, after pawn to f4, pawn to d5, white will play the main line, pawn takes d5. In this position, the most classical way of reacting here is pushing your pawn to e4, and while this move is generally speaking an okay move for black, it leads to a fairly complex game after pawn to d3, and there are a lot of forcing variations that you gotta know. Also, take into account this, if your opponent is playing King's Gambit all the time, he or she is probably well familiar with the resulting positions, which is probably not the case with you, as usually players do not pay that much attention to the King's Gambit since it's not the main opening. Therefore, to not be at a disadvantage, I recommend a simpler choice for you. Let's take a move back here, and instead of pushing your pawn forward to e4, you can choose the rock-solid move pawn takes f4. This is the really simple way for black to react to the King's Gambit and to actually frustrate white, as in this case you're shutting down any kind of an attacking attempts of white before they even try to execute any of them. Now, let's quickly think about the position in general terms. What have you achieved by making this trade of pawns? White capture your pawn on d5 and you capture the pawn on f4. There are a couple of good things that happened here for you. First of all, because the white pawn relocated from e4 to d5, they can never build the strong pawns in the center by placing one of their pawns to d4 and the other on e4, because the pawn is not on e4 anymore. So the first white's hope in the king's gambit to build up the strong center is already destroyed. Now, the next thing, after making this exchange, you're somewhat opening up the e-file against the white's king, and since white played the move pawn to f4, now this file is also potentially weak, together with the diagonal c5 to g1, because you can place your bishop there, which actually goes to show you that potentially you can actually start attacking the white's king sooner or later, because its position is exposed. And finally, the thing that I really like about this opening line is that you've got such an easy development. Since you already removed your central pawns, or rather moved them forward, now all your pieces are ready to come out real quick. The knight will jump to f6, your bishop will be developed, most likely either to d6 or c5, then you're ready to castle, your light-scored bishop will go to g4, you have free development of all of your pieces, therefore you are very likely to actually start attacking sooner, because it's so easy for you to develop all your pieces. And also, you can see that the black's moves here are just so natural that even if you forget the lines, you just develop your pieces, castle, and everything's good. Alright, now once we're done with the generalities, let's go into details. What should white play here? There is actually a threat that you created, which is queen can come out to h4 and check the white's king. And because the f4 pawn prevents white from playing pawn to g3, this queen h4 is actually a real threat, which will disturb the white's king and force it to make a move. That is why white is pretty much forced to play knight to f3 to get control over this square h4. Then there is an important nuance here. Even though you could take the pawn right away, that would expose your queen and give white an extra tempo for development of their knight, so they can bring it to c3 and attack your queen, which is not that big of a problem for you, but nevertheless you can avoid it. Instead of taking it with the queen, you play knight to f6 and you want to actually take this pawn with the knight. This way you'll get a strong centralized knight, and in addition to that, your knight can possibly protect that pawn on f4. For example, if white plays one of the main lines here, pawn to d4, which places their pawn in the center, but also prepares bishop takes f4. And then you say, wait a minute, and you capture this pawn on d5 while simultaneously protecting this pawn. Therefore, it becomes not that easy for the white's bishop to take it back and to somehow, equalize the material balance. Now, the most played move here for white is trying to still drive your knight away and force this move bishop takes f4, as otherwise it's also hard for white to develop this bishop anyway, because the only square is d2, which doesn't make much sense. Therefore, your opponent will probably play pawn to c4, hoping that your knight will go away and they'll grab the pawn. But then you have another really standard counter-attacking move here, which is worth remembering. Whenever your opponent places their pawns to d4 and c4, always consider the move bishop b4 check. In most of the lines here, it's a really annoying move. This puts the white's king under check, and it's not that easy to cover it without any other concessions. What can white do? White can't just cover it with the knight, because this square is controlled 2 times by the black's pieces, so it will be captured. So knight to c3 is not an option here. What else can white do? The other way is bishop d2, which is something that they'll probably do. But then you go knight to e3. Taking advantage of the pin here, so that the knight cannot be captured by the bishop, you're playing knight to e3 and also attack the queen here on d1, forcing it to move. We can already see that white's idea of taking the pawn back from f4, of winning this pawn, completely failed. Not only white couldn't take the pawn, but they actually allowed you to have this monstrous knight on e3, which is now attacking the white's position all around. And if they try to go queen a4, which is the most played move here, with a double attack to your king and bishop on b4, hoping that now at least they'll trick you this way, you go bishop d7, and after they win the bishop, you go knight to c2, which is a fork to the white's king and queen, and you're winning the queen, thus winning the game. This is actually a very played line, and you're very likely to trap your opponent like this. Alright, let's take a look at another line, which is actually the main line for white here. You're going pawn to d5, as we know, the counter gambit. After white takes it, you also take the pawn on f4. Then white is forced to play knight to f3, you respond with knight to f6. So that is the starting position of this line, basically. And here there are a couple options for white. We just analyzed one of the most natural moves, pawn to d4, and it somewhat failed. The other options would be trying to play pawn to c4 to protect the pawn, or maybe playing bishop b5, hoping for some quick development and disturbing your king. So these are the moves which we will analyze now. Let's start off with the move pawn to c4, as this is the main response of white. Then you play pawn to c6. The white's pawn on d5 is advanced, controls the center, and you'd prefer to exchange it. Moreover, after an exchange, it helps you to actually develop your knight with a tempo. And white probably will need to take this, because if not, well, you'll just take on d5 yourself and also get a great position. So if they take, you recapture with a knight, which is great, right? You develop a knight with a tempo, and white would need to push their pawn to d4. Again, if not, you can play bishop c5 and take full control over this diagonal, preventing the white's pawn from going forward and preventing the white's king from castling in the future. Therefore, white is more or less forced to play pawn to d4. And similar to the previous line, whenever you see that your opponent pushed both of these pawns forward, it somewhat weakens, the backward position, and so you can take advantage of this by playing bishop b4 check. Why do we play bishop b4 when they have the pawn on c4? Well, because if the pawn would be on c2, they could play pawn to c3 and just kick our bishop away. But once the pawn is already on c4, it can't go backwards against the chess rules, and now bishop b4 is a real attacking move. Okay, what can white play now? Well, usually it's knight to c3. Then you just castle, and you're ready to play rook e8 and start actually attacking the white's king here along the e-file. So they play bishop e2, hoping now to castle. Now already white is thinking about how to escape and how to ensure safety of their king. But you have one more attacking move, knight to e4, taking advantage of the fact that the white's king is still on e1, and you still have this pin. Therefore, together with a knight, you're now ready to take it and to create, to win some material and create problems for white. I checked it with the database. For some reason, the most common response of white was castle, which is a completely bad move. It's a losing mistake, but for some reason, most players actually play this move. In this case, well, you just happily take it with a bishop. I suggest taking it with a bishop, because after that, you can recapture with a knight, creating this powerful double threat to the queen and the bishop. Then after they play queen to d3, even though you can just take here on e2 and you're still having close to winning position, but there is a move which is even stronger, which is the move knight takes d4. Wow, what a move. Now your both knights are attacking this bishop on e2, and that is why it's not that easy for white to take any of your pieces. For example, queen takes c3 fails to knight e2, which is a fork to the white's king and queen. So that would be just losing. Let's take a move back and see what else white could play. If white plays a similarly better move, knight takes d4, there is another boom, queen takes d4. You're temporarily sacrificing the queen, because thanks to these little tactics, whether white goes king h1 or queen takes d4, it doesn't matter. You take on e2, this time it's check, and then you recapture the queen back, and as you can see, as a result of this forcing line, you just won a piece. Currently you're having an extra knight, and therefore a completely winning position. Let me show you something really cool here. I've opened the database with games, and here in the right corner, you can see the most played moves together with the number of games played. And you can see that the most played move is pawn to c4. Then you respond with pawn to c6. They're most likely, once again, we're going always up to the top line, meaning these are the most played moves by white. They go d4, bishop b4, the line which we have just analyzed, you castle, bishop e2, knight to e4, and like I told you before, they usually castle, which is a losing mistake, and their position is bad anyway. Well, I mean, it's not losing, but you're having some advantage here. But most played move is castle, which is losing the game immediately. So statistically, you are most likely to win the game, and not just showing you some rare lines that your opponents will never play. No, it's actually the opposite. These are the most played moves of white, which are losing. By the way, even though today we're talking about the king's gambit, pawn to f4 move, but what if your opponent goes knight to f3, the main line, most played move? Well, in this case, I've got you covered as well. I've got another video which I recorded recently covering one of the best traps in this line, in the classical line. I'll link it down in the comments below so that you know what to do here in this case. Alright, now let's come back to our today's discussion. Pawn to f4, king's gambit, you're counter-gambiting your own pawn, counter-attacking, and after this exchange, they need to go knight f3, knight f6, and so far we discussed the move pawn to c4, which was a rather bad choice for white. We also discussed that the move d4, another common move, is also doesn't quite work. So what else can white possibly play here? There is also a move bishop to c4. It's also one of the main lines, even though I don't completely understand the idea. It does not really protect the pawn, but anyway, a lot of players played, so let's figure out what you should do here. Of course, you can take the pawn. So again, bishop c4 did not really protect it because your knight is already protected by the queen. Anyway, let's say white castles, and then you've got an interesting move here, which I recommend, bishop to e6. It does a couple of things here. It provides, just in case, an additional support for the knight. It also blocks the e-file in advance so that you don't have to worry about some potential check by the white's rook, even though it's not dangerous really, but anyway, it's more of a prophylactic move. And along the way, it sets a nice trap. Your opponents, again, are very, very likely to get into this trap. What I also love about this line, which I'm sharing with you today, is that there are so many traps and so many bad lines for white, where they play seemingly normal moves, but all of a sudden they're losing the game immediately. And even if not, you're still getting a great game. So, for example, in this case, if white doesn't get into the trap, well, I mean, black's position is still just great. You just finalize your development somehow, right? The knight comes out, the bishop comes out, you castle, everything's simply great. But what if white plays pawn to d4, which is one of the most played moves here? In this case, you've got a sudden counterattack, knight to e3. White overlooked that your move bishop to e6 was not just a development move, it also prepared this discovered attack. You jump with your knight to e3, attacking the queen, but also your bishop starts taking this one. So after bishop takes on e3, you can take on c4, and now both of the white's pieces, the bishop and rook, are hanging. White cannot protect both of them, therefore you win some material. If white takes the pawn here, then you win the rook, queen takes, and you just have a material advantage. So you play, let's say, bishop d6, and white has no attack. They're underdeveloped, you know. You just won the exchange, and the next move you'll castle, and you've got a technically winning position thanks to your material advantage. We already discussed a number of moves for white here, pawn to d4, pawn to c4, bishop c4. You'll also need to know one last move, bishop b5 check, which puts your king under check, and you gotta know how to react here. The best defense is playing pawn to c6. Offense is the best defense. You don't just cover your king, you counterattack, which is something you're trying to do in all of these lines here, really. After pawn takes, once again, you can develop your knight with a tempo, meaning you don't spend any extra time. You actually covered your king from this check, but you also developed your knight, which is great. And in this position, there is one amazing way for white to win the game, to lose the game immediately, to win the game for you, is actually to castle. Very popular mistake. Natural looking move, hoping to play rook e1 and somewhat attack you, but the problem is that after castling, you've got queen b6. Just double attack to the king and the bishop, and on the next move you inevitably win the bishop. It's a very popular trap, so many players lost the game just like this. Right, now let's take a move back and see if there is anything better for white. If not castle, they are likely to play pawn to d4. Also a very standard move here. By playing pawn to d4, they always hope to take this pawn back on f4. Then, normally, you should try to not give it up so easily, right? So if possible, why not to keep it? In this case, you can play bishop d6, which is part of your development. You're developing a piece, preparing castle, but also it protects the pawn, so that it's not that simple for white to win it. And now, in this position, a lot of your opponents will think, hey, he just missed the move pawn to d5, right? Because the knight is pinned, it can't run away, and now, thanks to this pawn attack, it can be captured on the next move. That's why many of your players will play this move thinking that they got you and now you're losing a piece. Now, I'd like to ask you to think about this and to write it down in the comments below. What would you do here? Whether you will just resign or can you find anything better? Please write it down in the comments below. If you found this video helpful, consider subscribing to the channel so that you don't miss out on future updates. Thank you very much and best of luck in your chess battles.